Imagine standing in front of Buckingham Palace on a sunny afternoon, watching the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Hundreds of tourists snap photos, children point excitedly, and everyone maintains a respectful distance from the stoic soldiers in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. Now imagine one person, someone who believes their wealth makes them untouchable, deciding that these rules don't apply to them. Picture the moment when arrogance meets duty, when money crashes against honor, and when a single act of disrespect triggers a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. What happens when someone spits on a royal guard? You might think you know, but this story will challenge everything you believe about justice, consequence, and the power of standing up for what's right. This isn't just about one tourist's terrible decision. It's about how one moment of cruelty revealed the true character of everyone involved, and how sometimes the most unexpected people become heroes. Get ready for a story that will make you question whether wealth really can buy you out of any situation, and discover why sometimes the most silent defenders pack the most powerful punch. Marcus Wellington stepped out of his custom Rolls-Royce Phantom, adjusting his diamond-studded Rolex as the London air hit his perfectly groomed face. At 42, he had inherited more money than most small countries possessed, and he wore that privilege like an expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. His Italian leather shoes, worth more than most people's monthly salary, clicked against the pavement as he surveyed the crowd gathering around Buckingham Palace. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the famous forecourt, where hundreds of tourists had assembled for the changing of the guard ceremony. Children clutched their parents' hands, elderly couples shared cameras, and tour guides spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the tradition they were about to witness. For most people, being here was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a chance to see living history unfold before their eyes. But Marcus wasn't most people. He had visited Buckingham Palace 17 times before, each trip more extravagant than the last. Today's visit was different, though. Today he was angry. His personal assistant, Sarah, had called that morning with devastating news. The exclusive private tour he had paid £50,000 to arrange, complete with afternoon tea with a minor royal and a behind-the-scenes look at the staterooms, had been cancelled. Some diplomatic emergency, they said. Some meeting that couldn't be postponed. Marcus had screamed into the phone for 20 minutes, demanding compensation, threatening lawsuits, and promising to ruin careers. But the palace had been unmoved. His money, for once, couldn't buy him what he wanted. Now, standing among the common tourists, pressed shoulder to shoulder with people who probably saved for months just to afford their trip to London, Marcus felt his anger building like pressure in a kettle. His driver, James, stood nervously beside the car, knowing from 20 years of employment that his boss was in one of his moods. The crowd began to stir with excitement. The ceremony was about to begin. At exactly 11:45 a.m., the first notes of military music drifted across the courtyard. The crowd fell silent, a collective intake of breath as everyone strained to catch their first glimpse of the guards. Marcus pushed forward, using his broad shoulders and expensive suit like a shield, forcing people to step aside. A young mother with a toddler in her arms was shoved aside as Marcus claimed a prime spot directly in front of the palace gates. The woman stumbled slightly, nearly dropping her child, but when she looked up to see who had pushed her, Marcus was already looking elsewhere, completely indifferent to her struggle. An elderly man who had been standing there for an hour quietly moved aside rather than confront the obviously wealthy and obviously aggressive newcomer. Through the ornate iron gates, the famous royal guards began their procession. These were not actors or performers. They were active duty soldiers from the British Army's elite regiments, men who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other dangerous corners of the world. Their red tunics and bearskin hats might make them look like living toy soldiers to tourists, but underneath those ceremonial uniforms beat the hearts of warriors who had sworn an oath to serve Queen and country with their lives. Guard James Morrison, 26 years old and a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, stood at attention outside the sentry box. His face was a mask of professional calm, his brown eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing everything and revealing nothing. In his mind, he wasn't thinking about the crowd or the ceremony or even the weight of his rifle on his shoulder. He was thinking about his little sister Emma's birthday party next weekend and whether he would be able to get leave to attend. James had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester. His father was a factory worker, his mother a school secretary. They had taught him the value of hard work, respect, and duty to something greater than yourself. When he joined the army at 18, it wasn't for glory or adventure. It was because he believed in service, in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The crowd watched in fascination as the guards moved with mechanical precision, their faces emotionless, their steps perfectly synchronized. Children pointed and whispered questions to their parents. Teenagers tried to make the guards smile or react, waving and making faces, but the soldiers remained statue still. Marcus watched too, but his appreciation was different. Where others saw dedication and discipline, he saw an opportunity for entertainment. He had heard the stories about how the guards weren't allowed to move or react, no matter what happened. They were like living mannequins, paid to stand there and take whatever the public dished out. The ceremony continued, a spectacular display of British pageantry that had remained unchanged for centuries. The old guard was relieved by the new guard in a process that was both ancient ritual and practical necessity. Commands were shouted, salutes were exchanged, and the crowd watched in respectful silence as history played out before their eyes. But Marcus was getting bored. The novelty of being surrounded by commoners had worn off, and his anger about the canceled tour was growing stronger by the minute. He looked at the nearest guard, James Morrison, standing motionless in his sentry box, and began to formulate a plan. Marcus had always enjoyed pushing boundaries, testing how far his money and influence could take him. In restaurants, he would send back perfectly good meals just to watch the staff scramble to please him. At hotels, he would make impossible demands and then tip generously when they were met, creating a cycle of degradation and reward that fed his ego. But this was different. These weren't service workers depending on tips. These were soldiers sworn to protect the crown, men who had been trained to endure far worse than anything a spoiled tourist could dish out. The ceremony was reaching its climax. The band played God Save the King as the final inspections were completed. The crowd began to applaud, many people already reaching for their phones to capture the moment. Marcus stepped closer to the gate, close enough to speak to Guard Morrison without raising his voice. A few tourists glanced at him curiously, wondering why someone would approach the ceremonial boundary, but most were too caught up in the spectacle to notice. James Morrison stood perfectly still, his training keeping him focused straight ahead, even as he became aware of the well-dressed man approaching his position. In his peripheral vision, he could see expensive clothes, a gold watch, and the kind of confident posture that usually meant trouble. The ceremony concluded with a final flourish of music and a synchronized stamp of feet that echoed off the palace walls. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, hundreds of cameras flashing as people captured their memories of this special moment. Most of the tourists began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they had just witnessed, already planning their next stops on their London adventure. Parents gathered their children, elderly couples compared photos, and tour groups reformed around their guides. But Marcus remained exactly where he was, staring at the guard who stood at attention just a few feet away. The crowd was thinning, but there were still dozens of people nearby, many of whom were taking final pictures or buying souvenirs from the vendors who had set up along the street. Sarah, his assistant, had flown in from New York just to handle the details of what was supposed to be his private tour. She stood 20 feet behind him, nervously checking her phone and hoping they could salvage something from this disaster. She had worked for Marcus for 3 years, long enough to recognize the warning signs when he was about to do something spectacularly inappropriate. James Morrison continued to stand at his post, aware that his duty shift had another hour remaining. The ceremony was over, but his job wasn't. He was responsible for maintaining the dignity and security of this position until his replacement arrived. In his mind, he was already planning the report he would file at the end of his shift, attendance numbers, any security concerns, weather conditions. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, his life was about to change forever. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a platinum business card holder, a gift from his father worth more than most people's cars. He studied it for a moment, polishing it with his silk handkerchief, and then looked back at the motionless guard. The tourists continued to mill around, but the density of the crowd was decreasing as people moved on to their next destinations. Soon, there would be fewer witnesses to whatever Marcus was planning. A street vendor approached him, offering postcards and miniature replicas of the guards' hats. Marcus waved him away with such obvious disgust that the man quickly retreated, but not before Marcus caught a glimpse of the vendor's worn shoes and faded clothes. Another reminder of the class differences that separated him from everyone around him. The sun was higher now, warming the air and creating a pleasant atmosphere that made most visitors feel lucky to be experiencing such a perfect London day. Children laughed as their parents bought them toy soldiers from the gift shops. Couples posed for selfies with the palace in the background. Everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. Everyone except Marcus Wellington III, whose anger was about to boil over in a way that would shock everyone present and change the course of several lives forever. He stepped forward, crossing an invisible line between tourist and troublemaker, between curiosity and confrontation. Guard Morrison's training kept him motionless, but every instinct honed by years of military service told him that danger was approaching. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of duty, patience, and human dignity. What happened next would reveal the true character of everyone involved and prove that sometimes the most expensive education in the world can't teach a person the most basic lessons about respect and consequence. Marcus took another step closer to the sentry box, close enough now that he could see the individual threads in Guard Morrison's red tunic, close enough to count the brass buttons that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Other tourists gave him curious glances, wondering why anyone would approach the clearly marked boundaries around the ceremonial posts. But Marcus ignored them completely. His phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer in New York, something about a business deal that required his immediate attention. Marcus glanced at it and felt his anger spike again. Here he was, reduced to standing among common tourists like some ordinary person, while his carefully planned exclusive experience had been ruined by faceless bureaucrats who didn't understand who they were dealing with. James Morrison remained perfectly still, but his military training made him acutely aware of everything happening around him. He could sense the approaching figure in his peripheral vision, could feel the subtle shift in the crowd's energy as people began to notice something unusual happening. His breathing remained steady, his expression unchanged, but inside, every alarm bell was ringing. A young couple with backpacks and guidebooks stopped nearby, the woman pointing excitedly at the guard while her boyfriend took pictures. They were probably college students, Marcus thought with disgust, traveling on their parents' money and pretending to be worldly. He had been forced to share his space with people like this all afternoon, people who would never understand what it meant to have real power, real influence. Marcus's driver, James, watched nervously from beside the Rolls-Royce. In 20 years of working for the Wellington family, he had seen Marcus humiliate waiters, bellhops, and retail workers, always finding creative ways to remind people of their place in the social hierarchy. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. The driver pulled out his phone, wondering if he should call someone. But who? Marcus paid him extraordinarily well specifically because he never interfered, never questioned, never judged. That was the price of employment with the Wellington family, complete loyalty, no matter what. Sarah, the assistant, was also growing increasingly nervous. She had rearranged her entire schedule to fly to London for this tour, had spent weeks coordinating with palace officials, had even learned basic royal protocol to ensure everything went smoothly. Now she watched her boss approach the guard with the same expression he wore when he was about to fire someone or destroy a business competitor. The crowd around them was still substantial, maybe 60 or 70 people spread across the forecourt, but most were focused on taking pictures or reading information plaques about the palace's history. A few children ran around their parents' legs, energy unleashed now that the formal ceremony was over. An elderly tour guide was explaining the significance of the bearskin hats to a group of Japanese visitors. Marcus reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his phone. He opened the camera app and held it up toward Guard Morrison, taking several photos from different angles. Then, he switched to video mode and began recording, moving slowly around the sentry box like a predator circling its prey. James Morrison could see the phone in his peripheral vision, could hear the electronic beeping sounds as photos were taken. This wasn't unusual. Tourists photographed the guards constantly. It was part of the job, part of what made the ceremony special for visitors. But something about this particular tourist felt different, more aggressive, more personal. Marcus stopped directly in front of the guard, holding his phone at arm's length to capture both of their faces in the frame. He was close enough now that he could smell the wool of the guard's uniform, close enough to see the tiny details of the ceremonial medals pinned to his chest. "Smile for the camera, soldier boy," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the guard's ears but not loud enough to alarm nearby tourists. His tone was mocking, condescending, the voice of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. James Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he had heard the comment. His training was clear: ignore provocation, maintain dignity, never break character. He had stood motionless through thunderstorms, heat waves, and countless attempts by tourists to make him react. This was just another test of his professionalism. But Marcus wasn't finished. He lowered his phone and stepped even closer, now standing within arm's reach of the guard. A few nearby tourists began to notice that something unusual was happening, their conversations trailing off as they turned to watch. "I said smile," Marcus repeated, his voice slightly louder this time. "Don't you know who I am? I could buy this entire palace if I wanted to." A middle-aged woman from Germany tugged on her husband's sleeve, pointing toward the confrontation and whispering in concerned tones. A teenage boy with a Manchester United jersey stopped mid-sentence in his phone call home, suddenly, fascinated by the drama unfolding in front of him. Sarah took a step forward, finally, recognizing that her boss was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But she hesitated, knowing that any interference would result in her immediate termination. Marcus had fired 3 assistants in the past 2 years for far lesser offenses than publicly contradicting him. James Morrison continued to stare straight ahead, but his peripheral vision caught every detail of the growing scene. More tourists were stopping to watch now, sensing that something significant was happening, but not sure what. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the forecourt, and a gentle breeze rustled the flags above the palace gates. Marcus pulled out his business card holder again, extracting a single platinum card embossed with his name and the logo of Wellington Industries. He held it up in front of the guard's face, close enough that James would have to focus his eyes to read it. "Wellington Industries," Marcus announced, loud enough now that several nearby tourists could hear him clearly. "We're worth more than this entire country's defense budget. And you're just some working-class nobody playing dress-up for tourists." The crowd was beginning to take sides, even though they didn't fully understand what was happening. Some people seemed amused by the wealthy man's antics, assuming it was all part of some elaborate joke. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing the underlying cruelty in Marcus's tone. A security camera mounted on the palace wall captured every moment, its mechanical eye recording the confrontation for later review. Palace security personnel monitored dozens of such cameras from a control room deep inside the building, watching for any signs of trouble during public events. Marcus stepped back slightly and surveyed the growing audience. This was exactly what he wanted: attention, recognition of his power, proof that he could command any room simply by asserting his superiority. He had done this countless times before in boardrooms, restaurants, and private clubs, always with the same result. People backed down, apologized, offered compensation. But Guard Morrison wasn't backing down. He couldn't. His orders were clear, his duty absolute. He would stand at his post until properly relieved, regardless of whatever distractions or provocations the public might offer. This inflexibility, this refusal to acknowledge Marcus's obvious superiority, only made the wealthy man angrier. He was used to immediate deference, to people scrambling to please him the moment they realized who he was. The guard's continued indifference felt like a personal insult. Marcus looked around at the crowd, many of whom were now openly staring at the confrontation. He smiled, the expression cold and calculating, and raised his voice to address his impromptu audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in the tone of a circus ringmaster, "you're witnessing a perfect example of British stubbornness. This soldier here thinks he's too important to acknowledge his betters." Some tourists laughed nervously, unsure whether this was appropriate behavior or if they should intervene. Others began taking pictures and videos of their own, sensing that they might be witnessing something that would end up on social media. A police officer on routine patrol noticed the commotion from across the street and began walking in their direction, his trained eyes assessing the situation as he approached. But he was still 50 yards away, moving through the crowd slowly to avoid causing panic. Marcus turned back to the guard, his expression darkening as he realized his performance wasn't having the desired effect. James Morrison remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on the horizon, his breathing steady and controlled. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only the guard could hear. "You think that uniform makes you special. You think standing here like a statue makes you some kind of hero." He paused, studying the guard's face for any sign of reaction, any crack in the professional facade. Finding none, his anger reached a boiling point. "But you're nothing," Marcus continued. You're just a working-class grunt in a costume, performing for tourists like a trained monkey. And the best part is, you can't do anything about it. James Morrison's training held firm, but inside, he was fighting the urge to respond. Not with violence. His military discipline would never allow that. But with words that would put this privileged bully in his place. He thought about his father, who had worked double shifts at the factory to pay for his school uniforms. He thought about his mother, who had cleaned houses on weekends to save money for his sister's university fees. The crowd continued to grow as word spread that something interesting was happening at the palace gates. Phones emerged from pockets, and bags as people prepared to document whatever came next. Marcus reached the peak of his fury, his face flushed with rage and entitlement. In his mind, this lowly soldier had humiliated him by refusing to acknowledge his obvious superiority. The cancelled tour, the presence of common tourists, the guard's stubborn professionalism, it all combined into a perfect storm of wounded ego and unchecked privilege. And then, in a moment that would be replayed millions of times on social media and broadcast on news channels around the world, Marcus Wellington III did something that crossed every line of human decency. He spat directly into Guard James Morrison's face. The glob of saliva hit the young soldier's cheek and began to slide slowly down toward his jaw. For a moment, the entire forecourt fell silent, as if the very air had been shocked by what had just occurred. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps echoed across the courtyard, followed by angry muttering and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's disgusting," while another voice called for security. But James Morrison remained perfectly still, even as the saliva continued its slow journey down his face. His eyes never moved from their fixed position, his expression never changed, his posture never wavered. He was a royal guard, sworn to serve with dignity and honor, and not even this ultimate degradation would make him break that oath. The silence that followed Marcus's despicable act lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone present. The saliva glistened on Guard Morrison's cheek in the afternoon sunlight, a visceral reminder of what they had all just witnessed. Then, like a dam bursting, the crowd erupted in outrage. "Someone call the police," shouted a middle-aged woman from Scotland, her voice shaking with fury. She had brought her 2 young children to see the ceremony, wanting to show them something beautiful and meaningful about their heritage, only to witness this act of cruelty. A group of American tourists, who had been quietly taking pictures moments before, began loudly expressing their disgust. "That's assault," one of them yelled, already reaching for his phone to call emergency services. "You can't do that to a soldier." The teenage boy in the Manchester United jersey stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. "That's proper wrong. That is," he called out to Marcus, his Manchester accent thick with emotion. "He served his country, and you spit on him like he's nothing?" But Marcus seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around him. In his mind, he had finally gotten the reaction he wanted, not from the guard, who remained frustratingly motionless, but from the crowd. He had demonstrated his power, shown these common people what happened when someone refused to acknowledge his superiority. James Morrison stood exactly as he had before, the saliva still visible on his face, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. But, inside, something had changed. The humiliation wasn't just personal, it was an attack on everything he represented, everything he had sworn to protect. Yet his training held firm. He would not break. He would not give this wealthy bully the satisfaction of a reaction. Sarah, Marcus's assistant, finally found her courage. She approached her boss cautiously, her voice low and urgent. "Mr. Wellington, we need to leave. Now, this has gone too far." Marcus turned to her with a smile that was both cold and satisfied. "Has it? I think I've made my point perfectly clear." "Sir, please," Sarah continued, glancing nervously at the increasingly hostile crowd. "The police are coming. We need to get you out of here before this becomes an international incident." Across the forecourt, the police officer who had been walking toward the disturbance broke into a jog when he saw the crowd's reaction. His radio crackled as he called for backup, reporting a possible assault at the palace gates. Within minutes, additional officers would be on scene, along with palace security personnel. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond, a retired teacher from Wales, pushed through the crowd toward the guard. She was 73 years old, had taught primary school for 40 years, and had never seen anything so disgraceful in her life. "Young man," she called to Marcus, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with unruly children. You should be absolutely ashamed of yourself. Marcus turned to face her, his expression one of amused condescension. And you are? I'm someone who knows the difference between right and wrong, Dr. Hammond replied firmly. That young man is protecting you, protecting all of us. And you've just assaulted him in front of dozens of witnesses. A businessman from Tokyo, who had been quietly observing the ceremony with his family, stepped forward as well. In halting English, he addressed Marcus directly. In my country, we have great respect for those who serve. What you do, it brings shame. The crowd continued to grow as people arrived to see what was causing the commotion. Many began taking photos and videos, their phones capturing Marcus's face clearly as he stood defiantly in the center of the growing storm of criticism. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the control room operators had alerted their supervisors about the incident at the front gate. Security cameras had captured everything, and the footage was already being reviewed by senior palace staff. This wasn't just a minor disturbance. This was an assault on a Queen's Guard, an act that struck at the heart of British military tradition. Colonel Richard Hartwell, the commanding officer responsible for the Palace Guard, was summoned immediately. He arrived at the control room within minutes, his face grave as he watched the security footage. At 55, he was a career military man who had served in the Falklands, Northern Ireland, and Afghanistan. He had seen combat, had led men in life-or-death situations, but watching one of his soldiers being humiliated in this way filled him with a cold rage. Give me everything we have on this individual, he ordered his aide. Full background, financial records, business interests, everything. And contact the Metropolitan Police immediately. I want charges filed within the hour. Back at the gates, Marcus's driver James finally decided to act. He had watched his employer's behavior escalate beyond anything he had witnessed before, and he knew that no amount of money would protect Marcus from the consequences of what he had just done. He started the Rolls-Royce and pulled it closer to the crowd, hoping to facilitate a quick escape. But the crowd wasn't about to let Marcus simply walk away. A group of tourists had formed a rough circle around him, not threatening violence, but making it clear that they expected him to face consequences for his actions. Their faces showed a mixture of disgust, anger, and determination. You're not going anywhere until the police get here, declared a construction worker from Liverpool who had brought his family down to London for the weekend. He was a big man with calloused hands and a straightforward manner, and his presence alone was enough to make Marcus think twice about trying to push through the crowd. Marcus's phone began buzzing with calls and messages. Word of the incident was already spreading on social media, with hashtags like #SpittingGuard and #Buckingham Palace Assault beginning to trend. Videos taken by tourists were being shared thousands of times, each repost spreading the story to new audiences around the world. Dr. Hammond approached the guard with a tissue from her handbag. "May I?" she asked quietly, her voice gentle despite her fury at the situation. James Morrison couldn't acknowledge her directly, but he made the slightest possible nod, barely perceptible to anyone not watching closely. Dr. Hammond carefully wiped the saliva from his face, her movements tender and respectful. "You've conducted yourself with honor, young man," she whispered as she stepped back. "Your country is proud of you." The first police officers arrived on scene, their presence immediately changing the dynamic of the confrontation. Constable David Wright and his partner, Constable Sarah Chun, approached the crowd with professional calm, their trained eyes quickly assessing the situation. Right then, Constable Wright announced in a voice that carried across the forecourt, "We've had reports of an assault. Can someone tell me what's happened here?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of voices began speaking at once, all eager to describe what they had witnessed. Phones were thrust forward, showing video evidence of the incident from multiple angles. Marcus finally began to understand that his wealth and influence might not be enough to protect him from the consequences of his actions. He watched as the police officers listened to witness statements, their expressions growing more serious with each account of what had occurred. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I'm Marcus Wellington III of Wellington Industries. This is all a misunderstanding." Constable Chin stepped forward, her notebook ready. "Sir, we've had multiple reports that you assaulted this guard. I need to inform you that you're under investigation for common assault." "Assault?" Marcus laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "I barely touched him. Look at him, he's fine." "Spitting on someone is assault under British law," Constable Wright explained patiently. "We have multiple witnesses and video evidence. You'll need to come with us to answer some questions." The crowd began to applaud as the police moved to arrest Marcus. Dr. Hammond called out, "About time," while the construction worker from Liverpool nodded approvingly. Sarah, the assistant, stood helplessly by as her boss was read his rights. She knew that her job would probably end today, but, watching Marcus finally face consequences for his behavior, she found herself feeling relieved rather than worried. As the handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists, he looked back at Guard Morrison one more time. The soldier remained exactly as he had throughout the entire incident, standing at attention, eyes forward, dignity intact despite everything that had happened to him. "This isn't over," Marcus called out as he was led toward the police car. "I'll have my lawyers destroy all of you." But, even as he made his threats, Marcus could see the crowd of tourists watching him with contempt and disgust. These weren't business associates who needed his money or employees who feared for their jobs. These were ordinary people who had witnessed something terrible and refused to pretend it was acceptable. The police car pulled away with Marcus in the back seat, his expensive suit wrinkled and his carefully styled hair disheveled. Through the rear window, he could see the crowd still gathered around the guard, many of them taking photos of the soldier who had shown such incredible dignity under pressure. But the real consequences of Marcus's actions were just beginning. In boardrooms around the world, investors were starting to receive calls about the viral videos showing the CEO of Wellington Industries assaulting a British soldier. Stock prices began to fluctuate as news of the incident spread through financial networks. And, in a small control room deep inside Buckingham Palace, Colonel Hartwell was making phone calls of his own, setting in motion a series of events that would ensure Marcus Wellington III learned that some things in life are more valuable than money. Things like honor, respect, and the consequences of forgetting the difference between power and decency. The Belgravia police station had seen its share of high-profile arrests over the years, but the atmosphere was particularly tense as Marcus Wellington III was processed through the system. The custody sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Tom Bradley, had dealt with wealthy defendants before, but the sheer volume of evidence against this particular suspect was unprecedented. Within an hour of Marcus's arrest, the police had collected video footage from 17 different sources. Tourists had submitted smartphone recordings, security cameras from nearby buildings had captured the incident from multiple angles, and the palace's own surveillance system had documented everything in high definition. There was no question about what had happened or who was responsible. Detective Inspector Patricia Morrison, no relation to the guard, was assigned to lead the investigation. At 44, she had spent her entire career with the Metropolitan Police, working her way up from constable to her current position through dedication and an unwavering commitment to justice. She had prosecuted celebrities, politicians, and business leaders, always with the same approach. The law applied to everyone equally, regardless of wealth or status. "Let's see what we're dealing with," D.I. Morrison said to her sergeant as they reviewed the initial evidence. The video footage was damning, showing Marcus's deliberate approach to the guard, his escalating verbal abuse, and, finally, the moment of assault that had shocked everyone present. Meanwhile, across London, the story was exploding across social media platforms. The hashtag #SpitandGuard had been shared over 100,000 times in the first hour, with videos of the incident being viewed by millions around the world. News outlets were scrambling to identify the wealthy tourist, and it didn't take long for investigative journalists to connect the face in the videos to Marcus Wellington III. Wellington Industries' stock price began to plummet as investors realized the implications of their CEO being arrested for assaulting a British soldier. The company's board of directors held an emergency meeting via video conference, their faces grim as they watched the viral footage for themselves. Richard Thornton, the chairman of Wellington Industries and Marcus's longtime mentor, spoke first. "Gentlemen, we have a crisis on our hands. This isn't just bad publicity. This is a complete disaster for our brand and reputation." The other board members nodded in agreement. Wellington Industries had contracts with government agencies around the world, many of which included morality clauses that could void deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars if the company's leadership engaged in criminal behavior. Back at Buckingham Palace, Colonel Hartwell was conducting his own investigation. He had visited Guard Morrison immediately after the incident, finding the young soldier still at his post, still maintaining perfect discipline despite what had happened to him. "Private Morrison," the colonel said quietly, standing just outside the young man's line of sight, "your conduct today has been exemplary. When your shift ends, report to my office immediately." James Morrison acknowledged the order with the slightest nod, grateful that his commanding officer recognized his professionalism, but still maintaining his duty posture. In the palace control room, technicians were making copies of the security footage for multiple agencies. The incident had occurred on Crown property, making it a matter of national interest as well as a criminal investigation. The video would be shared with the Metropolitan Police, the Ministry of Defense, and ultimately with senior government officials who needed to understand the full scope of what had occurred. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond, the retired teacher who had witnessed the assault, spent her evening providing a detailed statement to police investigators. She had seen everything from start to finish, and her testimony would be crucial in ensuring a successful prosecution. That young soldier showed more courage and dignity in 5 minutes than most people demonstrate in a lifetime, she told D.I. Morrison during her interview. He stood there and took that abuse without flinching, without breaking character, without compromising his duty. He's a credit to his uniform and his country. Similar statements were being collected from dozens of other witnesses, each one adding another layer of evidence to what was already an overwhelming case. The businessman from Tokyo, the construction worker from Liverpool, the American tourists, all of them eager to ensure that justice was served. At the police station, Marcus was finally allowed his phone call. His first instinct was to contact his team of high-powered lawyers, but as he scrolled through his contacts, he realized that many of them specialized in corporate law, not criminal defense. This was uncharted territory for someone who had always believed his money could solve any problem. He eventually reached Jonathan Ashworth, a London-based criminal defense attorney who specialized in representing wealthy clients. Ashworth's reputation was built on his ability to minimize consequences for his clients through legal technicalities and strategic media manipulation. "Marcus, I've already seen the videos," Ashworth said without preamble when he answered the call. "We need to meet immediately. Don't say anything else to the police until I arrive." But even Ashworth, with all his experience defending the indefensible, was shaken by what he had witnessed in the viral footage. Spitting on a royal guard wasn't just assault. It was an attack on one of Britain's most revered institutions, an act that would generate public outrage far beyond typical criminal cases. The news media had begun arriving at the police station, setting up cameras, and interviewing witnesses who had followed the story from the palace. BBC News, Sky News, CNN International, and dozens of other outlets were preparing reports for their evening broadcasts. Emma Morrison, James's little sister, was studying for her university exams when her flatmate burst into their shared room. "Emma, you need to see this. Isn't your brother one of the guards at Buckingham Palace?" Emma's face went pale as she watched the video on her flatmate's phone. She could see her brother standing perfectly still as the wealthy tourist humiliated him, could see the saliva sliding down his face, could see the crowd's horrified reaction. Her first instinct was to call him, but she knew he would still be on duty, still maintaining the discipline that had been instilled in him through years of military training. Instead, she called their parents. Their father, David Morrison, was just finishing his shift at the Manchester factory when his daughter's call came through. "Dad, James is all right, but something's happened," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Someone attacked him at the palace today. It's all over the news." David Morrison's reaction was immediate and visceral. His son was his pride and joy, a young man who had chosen service over easy money, duty over comfort. The thought of someone humiliating James while he was unable to defend himself filled the older man with rage. Within hours, the Morrison family's phone was ringing constantly as news outlets tried to get statements from the guard's relatives. They declined all interviews, following military protocol, but their neighbors and friends weren't so restrained. "Jimmy Morrison is one of the finest young men I've ever known," his former high school teacher told a BBC reporter. "He joined the army to serve his country, and seeing him treated like this is absolutely disgraceful." The Manchester community rallied around their local hero, with social media posts supporting James spreading just as quickly as the original assault videos. The contrast between the spoiled billionaire and the working-class soldier who had remained dignified under attack resonated with people around the world. By evening, Marcus's lawyer had arrived at the police station, but the damage was already extensive. Wellington Industries stock had fallen by 12% in a single day, wiping out nearly $1 billion in market value. Government contracts worth hundreds of millions were being reviewed by nervous bureaucrats who didn't want their agencies associated with the company. The interview room at Belgravia Police Station was stark and functional, designed to strip away pretense and focus on facts. D.I. Morrison sat across from Marcus and his lawyer, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp as she prepared to begin the formal interview. "Mr. Wellington," she began, "you've been arrested on suspicion of common assault. Before we start, I need to remind you that you're still under caution. Do you understand?" Marcus looked to his lawyer, who nodded slightly. "I understand," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed at the palace. The gravity of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate his bubble of privilege. "Can you explain to me what happened at Buckingham Palace today?" D.I. Morrison continued. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Wellington III was being held accountable for his actions by someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or impressed by his wealth. The police interview room was one of the few places on earth where money meant nothing, where justice was supposed to be blind to bank accounts and social status. And, in that room, surrounded by overwhelming evidence of his crime, Marcus was about to learn that some consequences can't be avoided, no matter how rich you are or how many lawyers you can afford. The investigation was just beginning, but the wheels of justice were already turning, grinding slowly but inevitably toward a reckoning that would change multiple lives forever. 3 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the wheels of justice had turned with remarkable efficiency. The case against Marcus Wellington III was one of the most documented assaults in British legal history, with video evidence so comprehensive that even his expensive legal team couldn't find a credible defense strategy. The preliminary hearing at Westminster Magistrates' Court drew international attention. Media crews from around the world lined the street outside the courthouse, their cameras trained on the entrance where Marcus would soon arrive. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of the conflict between entitlement and dignity, privilege and service. Inside the courthouse, the public gallery was packed with supporters of Guard Morrison, many of whom had traveled from Manchester to show their solidarity with the young soldier and his family. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond sat in the front row, her presence a reminder of the moral clarity that had defined the crowd's reaction to the assault. Marcus entered the courtroom flanked by his legal team, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, but his confidence visibly shaken. The past 3 weeks had been a nightmare of falling stock prices, canceled contracts, and board meetings where his own directors questioned his fitness to lead the company. Wellington Industries had lost nearly $3 billion in market value since the incident, with major clients terminating contracts and investors fleeing en masse. The company's reputation, built over 3 generations, had been destroyed by 5 minutes of Marcus's uncontrolled rage. District Judge Sarah Pemberton, known for her no-nonsense approach to justice, presided over the hearing. She had reviewed all the evidence thoroughly, including the 17 separate video recordings and dozens of witness statements. The facts were not in dispute. Only the consequences remained to be determined. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Pemberton began, "you have been charged with common assault under Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988. The evidence against you is overwhelming and undeniable. How do you plead?" Marcus's lawyer, Jonathan Ashworth, stood slowly. Despite his reputation and expertise, he knew this was an unwinnable case. "Your Honor, my client pleads guilty to the charge of common assault." A murmur ran through the packed courtroom. Many had expected Marcus to fight the charges, to use his wealth and influence to create doubt or delay proceedings. The guilty plea, while legally sensible, felt like a moral victory for everyone who had been outraged by his behavior. Judge Pemberton nodded and made notes before continuing. "Mr. Wellington, before I proceed to sentencing, I want to address the broader implications of your actions. You didn't just assault an individual. You attacked a symbol of British service and sacrifice. Royal Guards represent centuries of military tradition, young men and women who have sworn to protect our institutions and our people." Marcus remained silent, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching shame. "Your victim, Private James Morrison, has served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, risking his life to protect the freedoms that you enjoy. He has conducted himself with honor throughout this ordeal, maintaining his dignity even when you stripped away yours." The judge paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "This court must send a clear message that wealth and status provide no immunity from the law, and that attacks on our service members will be met with the full force of justice." In the weeks leading up to the hearing, James Morrison had become something of a national hero. The video of him standing motionless while being humiliated had sparked conversations about duty, honor, and courage across British society. Military veterans had posted messages of support online, and donations to military charities had spiked dramatically. Colonel Hartwell had ensured that James received proper recognition for his conduct. In a private ceremony at Buckingham Palace, he had been commended for his exemplary behavior under extreme provocation. The palace had also arranged for counseling support, recognizing that being publicly humiliated could have lasting psychological effects. But James had shown remarkable resilience. In his only statement to the media, delivered through a military spokesperson, he had said simply, "I was doing my duty, as thousands of service members do every day around the world. The real heroes are my comrades who have made the ultimate sacrifice in service of our country." His humble response had only increased public admiration for the young soldier and deepened disgust for the wealthy businessman who had attacked him. Judge Pemberton continued with the sentencing. "Mr. Wellington, I hereby sentence you to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, contingent upon your completion of 200 hours of community service and payment of £25,000 in compensation to the victim." The sentence was harsh by normal standards for a first-time assault conviction, but the judge wanted to reflect the seriousness of the offense and its impact on British society. Additionally, Judge Pemberton added, "You are banned from entering the grounds of any royal residence for a period of 5 years, and you must attend anger management counseling for a minimum of 6 months." As the gavel fell, applause erupted from the public gallery. Dr. Hammond wiped tears from her eyes, while the construction worker from Liverpool who had helped detain Marcus nodded with satisfaction. But the legal consequences were only part of Marcus's punishment. Wellington Industries' board of directors had voted unanimously to remove him as CEO, citing conduct incompatible with the company's values and reputation. His personal wealth had been devastated by the stock collapse, and his social standing had been destroyed completely. The suspended prison sentence meant Marcus would avoid jail time if he complied with the court's conditions, but the community service requirement would place him in environments he had never experienced before. He would spend the next year working in homeless shelters, food banks, and community centers, performing manual labor alongside people he had always considered beneath him. 3 months after the sentencing, Marcus found himself washing dishes at a community center in East London, supervised by Margaret Phillips, a no-nonsense social worker who treated billionaires and homeless people with exactly the same level of expectation and respect. "You're here to serve," she had told him on his first day, "not to be served. You'll work the same hours as everyone else, follow the same rules, and show the same respect to our clients and volunteers." The work was harder than anything Marcus had ever experienced. His hands, previously soft from a lifetime of privilege, became calloused and rough. His back ached from lifting heavy boxes and cleaning equipment. But, slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Working alongside volunteers from all walks of life, serving meals to people who had fallen on hard times, Marcus began to understand what his wealth had insulated him from. These weren't the faceless masses he had always imagined. They were individuals with stories, struggles, and dignity that poverty couldn't erase. One evening, while serving dinner at the homeless shelter, Marcus encountered David Morrison, James's father. The older man had come to London for a military ceremony honoring his son and had stopped by the shelter to make a donation. When David recognized Marcus, their eyes met across the serving line. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, David approached the service window where Marcus was ladling soup into bowls. "You're the one who spat on my son," David said quietly. Marcus's hands trembled as he set down the ladle. "Yes, sir, I am." David studied him for a long moment, taking in the stained apron, the tired expression, the obvious transformation that months of community service had wrought. "My son wanted me to give you this," David said, pulling a handwritten letter from his jacket pocket. He wrote it after the trial. With shaking hands, Marcus took the letter and read, "Mr. Wellington, I hope your community service helps you understand what I've always known, that real wealth comes from serving others, not being served by them. I forgive you for what you did, and I hope you can find a way to use your resources to make a positive difference in the world. Respectfully, Private James Morrison." Tears ran down Marcus's face as he finished reading. The guard he had humiliated, the soldier he had degraded, had shown more grace and dignity and forgiveness than Marcus had demonstrated in 42 years of privilege. David Morrison watched the wealthy man cry over his son's words. "My boy says that anger is a poison you drink hoping someone else will suffer. He learned that in the army. Maybe you can learn it too." In the months that followed, Marcus completed his community service with a dedication that surprised everyone, including himself. He discovered talents he never knew he had, not for making money, but for making a difference. He learned the names of the homeless people he served, listened to their stories, and began to understand that dignity wasn't something you bought, but something you earned through your actions. When his sentence was complete, Marcus made an announcement that shocked the business world. He was donating 90% of his remaining wealth to military charities and organizations supporting veterans. He would use the remainder to establish a foundation dedicated to helping disadvantaged youth, with James Morrison as its honorary chairman. The transformation wasn't complete overnight, and Marcus would spend years earning back the respect he had squandered in those 5 terrible minutes at Buckingham Palace. But he had learned something that all his money had never been able to teach him: that true power comes not from what you can take from others, but from what you can give. James Morrison continued his military service with distinction, eventually rising to the rank of sergeant and becoming an instructor for new recruits. He never spoke publicly about the incident again, but his example of grace under pressure became part of military training programs around the world. The story of the rich tourist who spat on a royal guard became a modern parable about the difference between wealth and worth, between privilege and honor. It reminded people that in moments of moral crisis, our true character is revealed not by our bank accounts, but by our choices. And sometimes, if we're fortunate enough to face the consequences of our worst moments, we might discover that redemption is possible, not through money or influence, but through genuine service to others and the humility to accept that we all have something to learn about human dignity.